for our continuing of worship. And I just thought that the most difficult challenge of my career as a pastor was going to be at lunch after everybody had eaten and had their bellies full and trying to keep them awake at lunch. But then tonight, as we have the mood lighting and full bellies, I'm thinking this is going to be even more of a challenge. So we'll see if we can keep everybody awake now as we continue on. And we're going to continue on with our scripture lesson from tonight. It comes from Genesis chapter 18. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and he saw 3 men standing near him, and when he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them, bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah, and he said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd, and he took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They then said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he said, "Well, there in the tent." And then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "Hey, after I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" And then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah will have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God. So I'm going to start this reflection by taking a bit of a risk. I'm going to share with you some numbers. And I know that this is a risk because sometimes when you start talking numbers, there are some people's eyes that just glaze over. And for some people, it's a great way to put them to sleep. And after that meal, that's a possibility. It's not my intent, though. I'm really not trying to do that. But sometimes you have to use numbers to really drive a point home. And the point I want to drive home this evening is that our universe is gigantic. I mean, really, our universe is enormous. So let me put the numbers out there for you. There are an estimated 200 billion to 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. So let that sink in for just a moment and think about how big that is. And if that's not big enough for you, let me just show the next one. There are an estimated 200 billion trillion stars in the observable universe. Now that's a 2 with 23 zeros behind it. And there are an estimated 700 quintillion planets in the observable universe. And that's a number 7 with 20 zeros behind it. That's a lot of galaxies and planets and stars. And even in our own Milky Way galaxy, there are 40 billion estimated planets. And those numbers are almost incomprehensible. It's really tough to get your head around that amount. But there's one inescapable conclusion to that. The universe is gigantic. And so here's a question that has actually bugged some people for a while. And mind you, it doesn't necessarily bother those of us who believe in God, but it is a question that some skeptical people have. So it's like, in all of the vastness of this universe, with all of the galaxies and stars and planets, why would God single out this planet to interact with and to reveal himself to? I mean, that almost seems laughable. Why would the God whom Christians and Jews claim to have created the universe be so enamored with this little speck of dust relative to the vastness of the universe? And then, of all things, why would this God only reveal himself personally to one particular group of people and not to the entire population? So why wouldn't God just swoop down in cloud and fire or what have you with a great thundering voice and command people to love and respect him? That's a legitimate set of questions. And let's kind of return to our biblical text tonight and maybe get some insight to those questions. And maybe we won't get the complete answer, but I think we will glean some important ideas from this interchange between God and Abraham at the Oaks of Mamre. And so to do that, we have to actually start back in chapter 17 of the book of Genesis, the chapter right preceding the words that I read this evening. So God met with Abraham in chapter 17 to reaffirm the covenant that he first established with Abraham in chapter 15. And in chapter 17, God introduced the sign of that covenant, which is circumcision. And chapter 17 ends with Abraham circumcising all of the males in his household. It's also important to point out that God told Abraham in chapter 17 that his wife Sarah would have a son, even though she and Abraham were well past 90 years old. And you know what Abraham did when God told him that? We're going to hear this text actually on Sunday morning as well. Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Because it's certainly laughable, right? In the big scheme of things. You know, people who are over 90, they don't have kids. That's laughable that Sarah would. And that's an important point, because we're going to come back to that in just a little bit. So the next thing we were told at the beginning of chapter 18 is that the Lord appeared to Abraham at the Oaks of Mamre in the form of three men. And so one could argue that this is an early representation of the Holy Trinity, but we don't really have time to delve into that this evening. So what we will note is Abraham's reaction. So Abraham rushes out and he begs the men to stay. He says, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, wash your feet, and rest yourself under the tree. Let me bring a little bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." Now, I think this is a really, really interesting moment here, because Abraham is welcoming God. You see, Abraham invites God to stay with him, to have him wash God's feet, to rest, and to eat a meal. So let that sink in just a little bit, okay? Abraham is serving God and showing great hospitality to God. And again, it's almost laughable, right? Here is this mortal man washing God's feet and giving God something to eat. I mean, can you picture that? Can you imagine that? That's almost unfathomable. And Abraham here is not just, going skimpy. He's pulling out all the stops. The reading says, "And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, 'Hey, make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes.' And so Abraham then ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. And then he took the curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate." You got to understand, that's a major undertaking. I mean, this is way back in ancient biblical times. I mean, they didn't just have grocery stores on the corner back then. There weren't restaurants that you could run out to and buy food for your guests. This is an oasis in the middle of the desert. And yet, Abraham feeds his guests, who just happen to be God. And so here's an intriguing question. Think about this. Where else will God find someone who will serve him in this fashion? Where else will God find someone who will be hospitable to him and forge a relationship with him? Because, certainly God is to be feared because he is holy and just and mighty and powerful. But is there another place with another people who will also view God as someone to have a relationship with? And maybe there is, especially as big and as vast as our universe is. However, also given the parameters needed to have conscious life, and given the mind-boggling complexity of life itself, maybe there isn't. Maybe we are unique in this universe, and maybe we are the only forms of life that have the capacity to welcome God when he comes to us. And perhaps there's more. So let's continue with the biblical story. So after eating, they said to Abraham, "Where's your wife Sarah?" And he said, "Well, she's there in the tent." And then one of them said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of woman, which means she can't get pregnant anymore. And so Sarah laughs to herself, saying, "After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" And the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? So at the set time, I will return to you in due season, and Sarah will have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh, for she was afraid." But he said, "Oh, yes, you did laugh." So again, and little interesting tidbits here. And the Lord, again, remember he informed Abraham that Sarah would have a son in the previous chapter. So again, he says it again, that Sarah will conceive and have a son. And what did Abraham do in the previous chapter? What did he do? He laughed. And so what did Sarah do when she heard? She laughs. And I wonder if that isn't a clue as to why God interacts with us. Laughter. Laughter, the capacity and capability to laugh at something. To find the idea that a 90-year-old woman would conceive is laughable. That's the appropriate response. Most of us would do it too, because it also shows a healthy dose of skepticism. And maybe, just maybe, that skepticism is also a part of why God interacts with us. Because, if we just believed anything and everything, if we would have no grounding. We would be blown from belief to belief, from thought to thought, without any rhyme or reason. But we laugh. We're skeptical. We have the ability to find humor, and we have the ability to stand on the truth. Aren't those important traits? And then also we have the capability of fear. Sarah was afraid that she did something wrong when she laughed. And the lying part that she did, now that's not good. That's a knock against us. But to be fearful, that's not a bad thing at all. To fear the power and holiness of the God of this universe is considered a virtue throughout the Scriptures. So having that fear, a conscience, one might say, is actually important to having relationships that function. Healthy fear is good. So let's put it all together. Why would God choose us on this seemingly insignificant piece of dust in the middle of a gigantic universe? Well, we offer hospitality, we laugh, we're skeptical and stand on the truth, and we have a healthy fear. In short, we are made for relationships. We are made to come to the table and dine, not only with one another, but with God. And of course, God knows this about us. After all, He created us. And God longs to dine with us. God longs for us to welcome him and to serve him. Laughable? For some, maybe. But then again, maybe not. Not when God is a God of relationship. And we know from Pastor Casey's sermon last week that we have sinned and broken that relationship. Pastor Casey also helped us see that this relationship cannot be restored by us. We are in bondage to sin and cannot save ourselves. Therefore, it is up to God to restore that relationship. It is up to God to bring us to that place where that relationship is once again made whole. And that's why God comes to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. Because God has made a promise. Not only a promise to Abraham, but a promise to the whole world. Abraham was blessed to be a blessing. And the ultimate blessing will be a son. And no, not the son that was born to Abraham and Sarah, but the Son of God, who will be a descendant of Abraham. The Son of God who will offer himself for us and invite us to sit with him at the greatest table of all. Sin started at the first meal in the garden, but God's plan of redemption began unfolding by the oaks of Mamre as God came to dine with his people and to mend a broken relationship. Many more meals will be had, and we hope that you will join us throughout these next few weeks to see more of how God's work unfolds. Amen.